In this video, we're going to go over my recent Pixel Dailies submission for the Dam category and trying out a new palette for the first time. Okay, jumping into it. First thing I want to say about this particular palette is that if you are newer to pixel art or you're newer to art in general, these kind of palettes that are super desaturated are not easy to work with. There is some very subtle difference between some of the hues, and next to each other they tend to really blend. So especially working with pixel art where you're focusing on placing each individual pixel, it can really strain your eyes if you're working for a long time, and so taking breaks would be a very good idea for working with this. As far as this piece is concerned, I really wanted to kind of separate out main shapes to begin with, so I made the curve of the I think my starting point was making the line of the front of the dam with the little stair step from my reference image that just creates this nice kind of grounding for how the piece is divided up. It's on a nice third of the image, and then I got the curvature of the dam itself, kind of filled in some base color for like this is an empty space behind it, and then put the water behind that. So with those big pieces in place, I made sure to kind of put some shading on the edges to get better division between them. I was really kind of struggling with, again, the hues being very similar or very subtle in difference because the palette itself is so desaturated that I wanted to try and get some significant hue shift on the edges to really separate out where the edge of the dam is and where the edge of where the water becomes visible, where the mountain starts, that kind of a thing. This is me working on trying to have a smooth-ish curve for a shadow that's being cast from the mountain in the foreground, which is not easy to do in pixel art, especially if you're using clean lines. I tend to use the line tool for just laying out strokes instead of the brush tool specifically, because it helps you just kind of like keep a nice consistent like flow of your strokes. The brush tool can go faster and the line tool is more clicks, but I've seen a few other artists that use the line tool for their brush strokes, and it really does help create nice solid straight or slightly angled lines that tend to be pixel perfect anyways, so it ends up being pretty practical. Following the reference image here, I got the rusting and whatnot at the bottom of the dam. I think went a little overboard early, but just wanted to make sure that those shapes stood out. I really hated the fact that I had this big beige just in the middle of the piece that's just consuming the entire frame. So I was like, oh gosh, I gotta break that up somehow. But then I couldn't figure out clean ways to do it with just the resolution I had, so I distracted myself with other things that needed to get done. So and finished off doing some subtle highlights on the stair step at the side of the dam, and then thought about how can I create some diversity in the foliage and the rock shading on the cliffside over here. So again, just trying to figure out which colors I can use that are in the darker side of the palette to just create this nice kind of color variation in the area under the trees, the recessed area behind the rocks, because in theory the sunlight in this image is upper left, kind of foreground-ish, shining down on everything else. So anything that would be on that hillside on the left side of the image would generally be cast in shadow unless it was sticking out, and so that's how you have some of the lighter tones on the cliffside, and I'll do some highlighting on those later. But like this, I'm adding some highlights to just get some rock variation, some just outcroppings, and make it feel like it's sticking out. Didn't have a lot of opportunity, or didn't have a lot of options, I should say, in this palette for greens specifically, in terms of doing some highlighting and shading on the trees themselves. So I started out with the base color of the trees being the darker of the hues that are like just really specifically green, and then I figured I would do some very minor highlights on the top to just kind of get a tiered method. Again, this side of the mountain that is in the foreground here would be cast mostly in shadow, so I just wanted to try and do the tippy tops of treetops being highlighted to kind of let those forms stick out and feel unique as their own shapes, but not be overly distracting. Didn't like necessarily the fact that I was using the same color for the streaks coming down from the top of the dam as I used for the actual walkway at the top of the dam. So I tried to add some more color variation in that. From my reference image, I saw a lot of little minor streaks going into the big shadow cast from the mountain that were the rust color being highlighted for whatever reason. Either there's just a gash in the dam or something like that. Playing with some of the colors used for the water, I actually realized halfway through working with this that this seriously desaturated color that I'm using for the center of the water here was actually darker than the greenish blue. And so I was like, oh, well, I should just get the sheen of the water more centered towards the center of the water, and then move the darker hues out towards the edges as the sheen sort of wears off into the background and the foreground. So that's what I did. And then I thought, well, this shadow being cast, again, really getting caught up on the fact that the hues of the dam or the hues of the palette, sorry, are really close. So I just took one of the most extreme dark colors of the palette and just used that for, this is my dark shadow. I really want something cast here. This part, I wanted to start adding more details to the dam itself. And so I ended up just creating a new layer and creating some guidelines for myself so that I would just have a basis for the curvature of the dam in 3D space. I'd really recommend this to anybody that's doing art of any kind. Just giving yourself guidelines. And I colored them red just so I would easily remember, like, this is not in the actual image, this is your guideline. And then ended up using similar, I think I used the same color that I had used for some of the drips and leaking from the top of the dam to be the various, like, catch points, these little dot details that go across the dam, and really give it a sense of curvature and give it a sense of space and a sense of wear and tear. So that's what I'm doing with this. And it's always tough to try and figure out, okay, like, where should the thickness of your pixels be? I didn't like the fact that the lip of the top of the dam was basically bleeding into the leak points, so I tried to add a few of the lighter tone back to the edge of the dam to get, like, a highlight of, like, this is where the edge is, and drips will come off the top of it. I did a lot of jumping around here, so, like, I went back to do some detailing on the foreground mountain. Thought, I'll come back to that later because I need to do some highlights on the water itself to make it feel wavy, which the reference image had a lot of waves in the water, and I wanted to make sure that was represented in the pixel art, but I didn't know exactly how deep I wanted to go with it. This is an experiment, just trying to do, each hue being dotted in the next, or each color being dotted in, or like minor variants in the next color as it moves further out towards the shore. But I ended up just not going with that because it ended up making everything just super messy as I was going. Then I went back to the mountains, just wanting to create more color variants in them because it just kind of seemed, I don't want to knock the palette per se, because it is a good palette for a lot of things, and I've seen a lot of people have success with it, but it was kind of hard to get interest in some of the details. For things like the background, they don't have to be tons of detail, and they don't have to stick out per se, but at the same time, if people looked at them, I wanted there to be something there for people to find. So I was trying to add some more color variants and get a little bit more highlights and whatnot on various shapes that were sitting in the background and were on the hills. And because I used them in the background, I wanted to make sure I used them on the foreground hill structure here. So integrated some of the reds, some more rock color variation that just gets hit by this, especially since some of the shading or darker colors that I used on the foreground mountain were in the purple range. Having a red in there would actually make sense if it was like light touching rocks that were purplish when they were in shadow. I experimented with adding a different color into the trees to try and get a gradient between the highlight and the darker. Ended up not going with it. And then I think I did end up taking this green and running with it a little bit more, which worked out. It does give a little bit of hue variation in the trees itself, and it was something I could add to the background as well as the foreground. So it gave a good amount of color variation and a little bit more interest to everything that's going on. My outline of the shoreline to just help that shoreline read better in terms of how it wraps around the foreground wraps around into the background of the image. Had to adjust that a couple of times just because jumping back and forth between which colors to use for what purpose. And then I wanted to add a little bit more color variation in the dam itself to just be like, how does that orange get there at the bottom from the grayish, top leakage and the greenish whatever algae is on the dam surface? How does that turn into an orangish at the bottom, or how does that transition? So added a few specks of the orange color into the catches that I had already made with the green color. And then coming back to the foreground elements, because they are the foreground, so one would assume they need to be more rendered than the rest of the image per se. Just one of those, like, if somebody looked here, what needs to be here that they would find? Beyond that, just trying to make sure I had various interesting shapes sitting in, like, I didn't want big blobs of shade and shadow and things like that. I didn't want anything to be too large because it would just stand out as this is missing, right? This space is empty. Why is there nothing here on this image that has all kinds of color variation now throughout it? So just adding some minor highlights that could land on rocks and could be a light image, or like a piece of light. So there you have it, about 2 hours-ish work, boiled down to about 11 minutes time of speed paint. It just kind of goes to show you that if you play yourself back at 10x, it feels way cooler than when you did it the first time. I'm curious what people's thoughts are on this piece as a whole. I'm curious what people's thoughts on this palette are as well. Leave comments about that down below. If you'd like me to try a different palette, let me know about that down in the comments, and I'll go ahead and try those out. I'm pretty much game for trying new palettes out because I've been looking for good palettes to try and make pixel art with. So it's something I want to explore further. But until next time, have fun and keep working.